He mocked me at our mother's funeral. Not quietly either. Not in that careful, respectable whisper people use when they still want to pretend they have manners. He did it in front of cousins, neighbors, church women holding folded tissues, and two of my mother's old friends from work who had come all the way from another state. He stood there in a black suit that fit him better than grief did, looked at me while I was still clutching the folded copy of the program, and said, "Try not to make this about you for once, Vivian." I remember every stupid detail about that moment because pain has a way of preserving things you never asked to keep. The smell of lilies was so thick it made the back of my throat ache. The air conditioner in the funeral home was too cold, but my palms were damp anyway. Someone in the second row had a charm bracelet that kept making the smallest metallic sound whenever she moved, and even now, if I hear something like that, my chest tightens before I know why. I turned and looked at my brother Daniel, and for a second I honestly thought he might take it back. That maybe the pressure of the day had made him cruel in a temporary way. But he didn't look sorry. He looked annoyed. Like I was already inconveniencing him by standing there breathing near him, while our mother lay 10 feet away in a polished mahogany casket. I didn't answer him. Not because I had nothing to say, but because if I had opened my mouth, I would have said something ugly and permanent, and I knew my mother would have hated that. She spent her whole life trying to soften the edges of men who never learned how to be gentle on their own. First my father, then my brother. By the end of her life, I think it exhausted her. But it was the language she knew best. Cover. Smooth. Excuse. Endure. So I swallowed whatever rose in my throat and looked back down at the funeral program, at my mother's full name printed in elegant cursive, at the dates beneath it, and that was the first time it hit me that there would never be a future version of this. There would never be another Sunday call from her asking whether I was eating enough vegetables. Never another text telling me to wear a cardigan because restaurants keep the air too cold for women these days. Never another birthday card with $5 extra tucked inside for something sweet, even when I was 34 years old and making my own money. Grief is strange that way. Somebody can be dead for 3 days and your brain still hasn't caught up. Then one sentence, one stupid folded piece of paper, one cent in the room, and all at once the world becomes something harsher than it was a minute before. My name is Vivian Hale. I'm 34 years old. I have vivid green eyes people always comment on at the worst times, sharp cheekbones I inherited from a maternal grandmother I barely knew, and a reddish-orange asymmetrical bob that my mother once said made me look like a woman who knows things before other people do. She meant it as a compliment. Daniel meant it as an insult. "You always have that smug look," he used to tell me when we were younger, usually after I'd quietly done something he was supposed to do and gotten blamed anyway for not doing it sooner. Families create versions of you early. Mine decided I was the difficult one mostly because I noticed everything. The truth is, Daniel had been mocking me in smaller ways long before the funeral. The funeral was just the first time he stopped hiding it. He's older than me by 4 years, handsome in the broad-shouldered, all-American way that makes older women forgive him too quickly and younger women think he must be nicer than he is. Growing up, he was the kind of boy adults described as spirited when they meant selfish, confident when they meant arrogant, and a little rough around the edges when they meant he had already learned the world would excuse him more than it would ever excuse me. My mother loved us both. I need to say that clearly because family stories get flattened into villains and saints too easily. She loved us both. But she worried about him and relied on me, and those two things, over the course of decades, built a house no one admitted I was trapped inside. When we were children, Daniel broke things and I cleaned them up. He forgot homework and I sat next to him while he copied mine just enough not to get caught. He got grounded for talking back, and my mother cried privately in the kitchen because she didn't know what she was doing wrong. I would sit at the counter doing spelling words while she wiped already clean surfaces with a dish towel and stared out the window. And after a while she'd say, "Your brother has a good heart." It became one of her favorite sentences. It was the ribbon she tied around every wound he left behind. Your brother has a good heart. Your brother is going through something. Your brother doesn't mean it that way. Your brother needs time. Your brother feels things deeply. Meanwhile, I was the one who remembered to sign permission slips, the one who knew when milk was about to expire, the one teachers said was so mature, which is sometimes just adult code for a child who has learned not to need too much in public. One of my clearest memories is from when I was 10. Daniel was 14 and furious because my mother wouldn't let him go to a lake party with older boys she didn't trust. He slammed his bedroom door so hard a framed family photo rattled off the hallway table, and the glass cracked diagonally across my face. I still remember crouching on the floor picking the shards out of the carpet while my mother stood outside his room begging him to open it. Not once did she tell him to come help me clean up the mess he caused. Not once did she say, "Vivian, leave that." She was too busy managing him. I can still feel the tiny sting in my fingertip when a sliver of glass went under my skin. I didn't cry. I just put my finger in my mouth and kept picking up the pieces because somebody had to. That was our pattern for years. Daniel generated storms. I became good at moving furniture before they knocked things over. By the time we were adults, it looked more polished from the outside. He had charm, connections, a talent for making even his laziness sound temporary and strategic. I had a steady job in estate administration for a boutique law office, my own apartment, a habit of paying bills early, and the kind of practical personality family members start leaning on without ever fully thanking. When our father died, it was me who handled the paperwork while Daniel gave a teary speech at the repast about legacy and family. People hugged him like he was carrying the world. I was the one at the church office making sure the death certificate copies were ordered correctly. I should tell you about our mother before I tell you about the reading of her will, because she deserves to exist in more than just the shadow of what happened after she died. My mother, Eleanor Hale, had a laugh that arrived in two parts. First, there was this short, surprised inhale, like joy had caught her off guard. Then came the rail laugh, warm and full and impossible not to join. She loved old perfume bottles, Sunday crossword puzzles, peach pie, and those terrible made-for-TV Christmas movies where the ambitious woman learns the meaning of small-town life from a widower who owns a hardware store. She had a soft spot for underdogs, clearance sales, and any child who seemed left out in a room full of louder siblings. She worked for nearly 28 years in the administration office of a public middle school, where she became the woman every parent asked for, because she knew how to speak calmly to angry people without surrendering to them. She was beautiful in a quiet way that deepened with age. Not flashy, not dramatic, but elegant. Deliberate. Even in the hospital, near the end, she'd smooth the blanket across her lap before a visitor came in. She and I were close, but not in the movie way where mothers and daughters always say the right thing and heal each other with one conversation. Ours was messier. She leaned on me too much sometimes. I resented her for it and hated myself afterward. There were days I felt more like her partner in survival than her child. But there was love, real love, in all the ordinary corners. She knew when I was pretending I was fine by the way I over-explained simple things. I knew she was worried when she started talking about the weather for too long. We didn't always fix what was wrong. We just stayed near it together. The year before she died, her health changed in small ways before it changed in frightening ones. First, it was fatigue. Then missed calls because she'd fallen asleep in the middle of the afternoon. Then that vague, dismissive language doctors sometimes use right before the tests become serious. I went to appointments with her whenever I could. Daniel came to exactly 2. Both times he was late and left early, but he made sure to post about family being everything. That was the thing about my brother. He loved the appearance of devotion. He liked being seen near suffering as long as someone else was handling the practical side of it. When our mother needed help with groceries, medication schedules, home health paperwork, follow-up calls, insurance confusion, cleaning, laundry, and sitting with her on the nights she was too nauseous to sleep, it was me. Daniel said he wanted to help, but he was juggling a lot. Daniel was always juggling a lot. A startup idea, a consulting deal, a real estate opportunity, a rough patch with someone he was dating, stress, timing, the universe. There was always some adult-sounding explanation that somehow never ended with him doing the thing. At first, my mother still defended him. "He's trying," she would say from her recliner while I sorted out 3 different pill bottles under the yellow lamp in her living room. "He gets overwhelmed." I wanted to ask her what she thought I was. A machine? A saint? Some daughter-shaped extension of her own sense of duty? But I almost never asked the questions I should have. I would just look down at the labels and say, I know. The last real argument we had happened about 3 months before she died. I had just spent 2 hours on hold untangling a billing mistake, then driven across town because her home nurse said she'd been dizzy all morning. Daniel had promised to stop by with soup and electrolyte drinks. When I got there, the front porch was empty. No bags. No Daniel. My mother was pale and trying to sound cheerful in the way sick people do when they feel guilty for being sick too loudly. I called him from her kitchen. He answered on the 4th ring, music loud in the background. "Where are you?" A pause. "What do you mean?" "You said you were bringing her soup." "I'm tied up. I'll go later." "You said noon." "It's after 4. "Vivian, lower your voice." I actually laughed then. One of those sharp, disbelieving laughs that hurts your own feelings when you hear it. "I'm in Mom's kitchen, Daniel. She's been waiting for you all day." He exhaled like I was exhausting him. "You're there, aren't you?" That sentence did something to me. Even now I can feel the heat of it. Not because it was new, but because it was the truest thing he had ever said out loud. "You're there, aren't you?" As if my presence erased his absence. As if my competence had become his permission. As if being the reliable one meant my labor no longer counted because everyone had simply built it into the structure of reality. I said very quietly, "One day she's going to see you clearly, and you are going to hate how late it happens." He went silent for half a second, then gave this hard little laugh. "You've always wanted that, haven't you? To be the better child." I hung up because there are moments when continuing a conversation becomes a form of self-harm. That evening my mother cried after I tucked a blanket around her legs. Not loudly. Just tears sliding into the lines at the side of her mouth while she stared at the muted television. "Don't fight with him because of me," she whispered. I sat on the ottoman in front of her and looked at her face, at how tired she was, how thin, how determined she still seemed to keep carrying emotional furniture she no longer had the strength to lift. "I'm not fighting with him because of you," I lied. "I'm fighting with him because he keeps handing me pieces of his life and acting like they were mine all along." She closed her eyes. "I know I asked a lot of you. That should have felt like vindication, but it didn't. It just made me sad. I wanted to do it," I said, and that was true too. That was the terrible thing. Love and resentment can sit in the same chair and both feel fully justified. A week before she died, she asked me to bring her lipstick. That tiny request crushed me more than some of the bigger ones. She had barely been eating. Standing made her dizzy. but she still wanted lipstick before the hospice social worker visited. I found the tube in her bathroom drawer, the rosy nude she'd worn for years, and knelt beside the bed while she dabbed it on using the little mirror from her purse. Then she looked at herself for a moment and said, "There. I look like myself again." No one tells you how humiliating illness can feel to the person inside it. Later that night, when Daniel finally arrived with flowers he definitely bought at the grocery store on the way over, she was too tired to talk much. He kissed her forehead, stood there looking stricken, and I watched him arrange his face into grief like he was trying on the suit ahead of time. Maybe that sounds cruel. Maybe there was some real pain in him too. I think there probably was. But real pain and performance can live side by side. I know that now. She died on a Thursday morning just before sunrise. I was there. Daniel wasn't. The hospice nurse had stepped out to call the doctor, and the room was very still in that unnatural way rooms become when someone is almost gone. I was holding her hand, rubbing my thumb across the papery skin at the back of it, talking softly even though I'm not sure she could still hear me. I told her the azaleas outside her bedroom window were beginning to bloom. I told her the yellow mug she liked was still by the sink because I couldn't bring myself to wash it yet. I told her I loved her. I told her it was okay to rest, and I hated myself even as I said it, because nothing about it felt okay. Her last breath wasn't dramatic. It was barely anything. Just a body loosening its hold. I called Daniel 3 times before he picked up. He sounded asleep, then startled, then devastated in that immediate loud way some people are when they were not there for the quiet part. He kept saying, "No, no, no," while I sat at the side of her bed and watched morning light begin to move across the curtains. I remember thinking absurdly that I still needed to cancel the podiatry appointment she had scheduled for next Tuesday. That's grief too. Part sorrow, part administration. Everything after that felt like being dragged by a current. Funeral arrangements. Clothing. Food trays. Calls. Flowers. Church coordination. Death certificates. My mother had named both Daniel and me as co-executors in an older draft of her estate documents years earlier, but in the final months she had revised some things through her attorney. I knew because I had driven her to the office. She didn't tell me every detail. She only said, "I need to make things simpler." I assumed she meant cleaner instructions, fewer loopholes, maybe a healthcare clarification. I didn't pry. The lawyer she used, Margaret Voss, worked with our firm often enough that I knew her professionally, but I recused myself completely. I wanted no part in influencing anything. Daniel, however, became strangely animated the closer we got to the funeral. He kept referring to the house situation and how Mom would have wanted things handled with a confidence that annoyed me because it sounded rehearsed. More than once, he reminded people within earshot that he had children to think about, as though I didn't also have a life, bills, losses, and years of unpaid devotion behind me simply because I didn't have a wife and toddlers to display as moral leverage. The night before the funeral, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying fragments from childhood I hadn't thought about in years. My mother braiding my hair too tight before 4th grade picture day. Daniel shoving the bathroom door with his foot while I was trying to blow dry it because he was late and somehow that became my fault. Thanksgiving mornings when I helped my mother peel potatoes while he watched football and wandered in just in time to be praised for carrying folding chairs from the garage. It wasn't one great injustice that broke me. It was the accumulation of tiny, lopsided permissions. A life of being useful in ways that never seemed to become visible. So by the time he mocked me at the funeral, I was already made of exposed nerves and old bruises. I got through the service by focusing on details. The organist missed one note in Amazing Grace. Mrs. Pelham from down the street dabbed at her mascara with the edge of a napkin. My mother's minister told a lovely story about how she once bought winter coats for two sisters at school without telling anyone. Daniel cried at exactly the points people tend to cry when they know others are watching. I stood when I was supposed to stand, sat when I was supposed to sit, and delivered my reading without letting my voice break until the last sentence. Afterward, during the burial, the wind kept lifting the ends of my hair into my face, and I remember thinking my mother would have reached up automatically to smooth it back. At the reception in the church hall, people came to me with that look people get when they know who did the real caregiving. It is a look made of pity, gratitude, discomfort, and relief that they themselves were not the one waking up at 2 a.m. to change bedding after a bad night. They said things like, "You were such a blessing to her, and she leaned on you so much, and I know this must be especially hard for you." Daniel hated that. I could feel it. Every kind word to me seemed to tighten something in him. By then his wife, Melissa, had started hovering in that polished, strategic way of hers, slipping into conversations just before they became honest. Melissa and I were never close. She isn't loud or obviously cruel. In some ways, that would have been easier. She's the kind of woman who can make a condescending sentence sound like concern if she tilts her head just right. Early in their marriage, she once told me, smiling, "Daniel really appreciates how dependable you are. Not everyone is built for the family life path, so it's nice that you can be available." I was 29, single at the time, and standing in my own apartment holding a casserole dish I had brought after the birth of their second child. I knew exactly what she meant. Women like Melissa always believe they are only describing reality when they're actually arranging it. 3 days after the funeral, we met at Margaret Boss's office for the reading. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to sign whatever needed signing and vanish for a month. But another part of me, the part my mother said always knew things before other people did, felt a low, steady pull in my chest. Not expectation. Just the sense that something unfinished was waiting in that room. Margaret's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown with creaky hardwood floors and frosted glass doors. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, which is a smell I've always found comforting, but that day it made me feel sick. Daniel sat across from me, knee bouncing, his tie loosened just enough to suggest sorrow without looking careless. Melissa sat beside him with a legal pad she never wrote on. I sat alone, my black dress wrinkled at the waist from the seatbelt in my car, hands folded in my lap so no one would see them tremble. Margaret came in carrying a slim file and a sealed envelope. I noticed the envelope immediately because it had my mother's handwriting on the front. Not elegant party card handwriting. Her real handwriting. Slight rightward slant. Firm downstrokes. My name, Vivian. My stomach dropped so fast I felt lightheaded. Margaret took her seat, offered condolences again, then began with the formal language. Last will and testament. Sound mind. Dates. Witnesses. Revocation of prior versions. I'd heard variations of this language 100 times in professional settings, but hearing it attached to my mother made it feel almost obscene, like bureaucracy had put on mourning clothes. Then she said, "Mrs. Hale's final will includes a revised appointment of executor. Her first named executor is her daughter, Vivian Hale." For a second, no one moved. It was such a small sentence, but it split the room open. Daniel blinked like he hadn't heard correctly. "Excuse me." Margaret didn't flinch. "Your mother appointed Vivian as sole executor of her estate. You are named as a beneficiary, but not as co-executor in the final instrument." He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's impossible." Margaret folded her hands. "It is not impossible. It is the valid, executed document. Melissa leaned forward. There must be some mistake. Daniel handled a lot for her. I actually turned and looked at her then, because the audacity of that sentence almost overrode my grief. Handled a lot. I thought of pill bottles, insurance forms, soiled sheets, pharmacy pickups, canceled lunches, unpaid time off, nights I drove home crying from pure exhaustion, and then got up and went back the next morning because my mother needed help to the bathroom and was too embarrassed to ask the aide. Handled a lot. Margaret continued, calm as winter. Your mother made this revision 8 months ago. She was very clear. Daniel's face changed in stages. Confusion first, then anger, then something worse, something childish and humiliated. Of course she was clear, he muttered. Vivian always knew how to get in her ear. I felt the heat climb up my neck. For most of my life that accusation would have worked. It would have made me defend myself, over-explain, try to sound fair so no one could call me bitter. But grief had scraped something clean inside me. I just looked at him and said, I was in her life, Daniel. That's not the same thing. The silence after that was so complete I could hear the air vent. Margaret resumed reading. Specific bequests. Jewelry. Charitable donation. A small education fund for each grandchild. Personal effects to be distributed according to an attached memorandum. The house, our childhood home, modest but fully paid off, was to be sold, with a larger percentage of the proceeds allocated to me than to Daniel. Not everything. Not some cinematic disowning. But enough to say what she had never fully said while alive. Enough to acknowledge imbalance. Enough to make Daniel's jaw harden until I thought he might crack a molar. Then Margaret set aside the formal document and lifted the envelope. There is also a personal letter Mrs. Hale left with instructions that it be read after the will, because, in her words, some things matter more when they are heard while everyone still has to sit there. That was so unmistakably my mother that I almost laughed and cried at the same time. Margaret opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the paper. I won't quote every line, because some things feel too intimate to repeat exactly, but I remember the shape of it. The feeling. The room narrowing around her words as if my mother had stepped back into it for one final moment and refused to be interrupted. She wrote first to both of us. She said she loved us equally, but love and trust were not always measured the same way in a life. She wrote that one child had often been protected from consequences, while the other had been protected by no one and became strong because of it. She said she regretted that. She said dependence had become so natural in our family that gratitude had too often gone unspoken until it was nearly erased. Then she wrote directly to me. She thanked me for every quiet thing. Not the big dramatic acts. The quiet things. The rides, the lists, the patience, the calls, the nights. The way I learned to anticipate what hurt before she had to ask. She wrote that I had carried more than my share for years, long before she got sick, and that she saw it even when she failed to stop it. She said she was sorry for every time my strength was mistaken for endlessness. I broke then. Not elegantly. Not with one cinematic tear. I put my hand over my mouth and bent forward and cried in these ugly, shocked sounds because all my life I had wanted someone in that family to say exactly that. Not, you're so capable. Not, I knew you'd handle it. Not, that's just Vivian. I wanted someone to say it was too much and it should not have been yours. Margaret paused to let me compose myself, then continued. My mother addressed Daniel last. She wrote that she had loved him fiercely, perhaps too protectively, and had mistaken shielding him for helping him. She wrote that charm was not character, and good intentions were not the same as responsibility. She said she hoped one day he would become the kind of man who showed up before being praised for showing up. The last line was the one that settled over the room like a verdict. She wrote, "If your sister's name is read first, it is because for most of your lives, she came first in every way that required sacrifice." No one said anything after Margaret finished. Daniel stared at the conference table. Melissa looked furious in that controlled way people do when they know open outrage would make them look guilty. I sat there with tears drying on my face and felt something shift so deeply inside me that I can only describe it as a room unlocking. It wasn't triumph. Not exactly. My mother was still dead. The years were still the years. Nothing rewrote childhood. But there is a particular kind of peace that comes from finally no longer arguing with your own memory. I had spent so much of my life doubting the evidence of what I lived. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was keeping score. Maybe Daniel really did mean well more than I gave him credit for. Maybe my exhaustion was partly my fault for not setting better boundaries. Maybe. And then there, in my mother's own words, was the truth I had been carrying alone for decades. She had seen it. Late, imperfectly, painfully late, but she had seen it. Daniel pushed his chair back, so abruptly it scraped across the hardwood. "This is unbelievable." Margaret's voice stayed even. "It is final." He stood up and looked at me, and for once there was no performance on his face. No charming sun mask. No wounded boy excuse. Just naked resentment. "You're enjoying this." I looked up at him through the last blur of tears and said the most honest thing I had said in years. "No. I'm grieving the fact that it took our mother dying for someone to tell the truth in front of you." That landed. You could see it land. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then grabbed his jacket and walked out. Melissa followed after a stiff mutter about reviewing options, as if maternal regret could be appealed. After they left, Margaret quietly slid the original letter across the table to me in a clear sleeve. "She wanted you to have this." I took it with both hands. I don't know why that detail matters, but it does. Both hands. Like receiving something fragile and holy. I sat in my car for nearly 40 minutes before driving home. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check my phone. I just held the envelope in my lap and stared through the windshield at people going about their ordinary Tuesday lives. A man in a blue shirt walked by carrying iced coffees. A woman argued with a parking meter. Somewhere down the block, a siren rose and faded. Everything looked offensive in its normalcy. How could the world keep moving when I had just been handed proof that my whole life was exactly what I thought it was? That night, Daniel called 6 times. I let it ring. Then he texted. "She manipulated Mom." Another text. "You know this isn't right." Then, "We need to talk like adults." I laughed out loud in my dark apartment at that one. Like adults. The language people use when they want the benefit of maturity after avoiding its costs. Over the next 2 weeks, the ugliness came in waves. Melissa sent a long message about family harmony and misunderstandings, carefully avoiding any mention of the actual letter. An aunt I barely saw suddenly called to remind me that your brother has a family. A cousin hinted that my mother must have been under stress when she revised the will. I realized very quickly that the truth, when finally spoken, does not always make everyone nobler. Sometimes it just reveals who is quietly benefiting from the lie. But something in me had changed. I did not rush to smooth things over. I did not volunteer extra explanations. I handled the estate with professionalism, transparency, and exactness. Every distribution was documented. Every communication went through the proper channels. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to make my brother comfortable with reality. And then something I didn't expect happened. Without the old role to occupy, I started noticing how tired I was. Not funeral tired. Life tired. Bone deep. Decade-long tired. I had built so much of my identity around being dependable that I didn't know what remained when I wasn't actively rescuing somebody. I would come home from work and stand in my kitchen with my keys still in my hand, staring at nothing. Some nights I ate cereal for dinner. Some nights I reread my mother's letter and cried for different reasons than before. Not just for what happened. For what didn't. For the girl I had been, the young woman, the daughter who learned that love often arrived disguised as usefulness. About 2 months later, I went to clear out the last of my mother's bedroom drawers before listing the house. There's a particular silence in a house after the personal things start leaving it. The walls feel embarrassed. The rooms become shapes instead of places. I folded sweaters, boxed costume jewelry, sorted old birthday cards tied with ribbon. In the back of her nightstand drawer, beneath a packet of tissues and 3 expired coupons, I found a photograph I'd never seen. It was of me at maybe 11 years old, standing in our backyard in an oversized denim jacket with one side of my hair hacked shorter than the other because I'd tried to trim it myself. I was holding a garden hose like a microphone, grinning at something off camera. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, it said, "Vivian," before she learned to hide when she was hurt. I sat on the floor with that picture in my hand and cried harder than I had at the will reading. Because there it was again. Not just that she saw me later. She had seen me then. Not perfectly enough to change things. Maybe not bravely enough. But she had seen me. That mattered more than the money. More than the house percentage. More than my name being read first. Those things were symbols. Useful ones, necessary ones. But the real inheritance was the truth. The truth that I had not imagined the imbalance. The truth that love given quietly still counted. The truth that being the responsible daughter had cost me pieces of myself I deserved to grieve too. Daniel and I barely speak now. Sometimes people hear that and immediately look for the moral about forgiveness, because everyone loves forgiveness when they are not the one who paid for the lesson. I'm not against it. I'm just no longer interested in counterfeit versions of it. The kind where the hurt person is expected to become spiritually impressive, while the person who did the hurting remains mostly unchanged. Maybe one day he'll become someone I can know again. Maybe not. That is no longer my project. The last time I saw him was at the closing of the house. He looked older somehow. Not wiser. Just less polished. He tried once awkwardly to say, "Mom loved us both." I said, "I know." And for once I didn't add anything to make him feel safer inside the conversation. Because she did love us both. That was always the tragedy. Love was there, but love without honesty can become another form of neglect. Love without accountability can feed the very thing that destroys a family from the inside. My mother understood that too late, but she understood it. And at the end, she did the bravest thing she had maybe ever done for me. She told the truth where no one could interrupt it. So when people ask me now what it felt like hearing my name read first, I tell them the honest answer. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like being returned to myself. It felt like every invisible hour finally taking shape in the air. It felt like the child on the floor picking up shattered glass while everyone worried about the person who broke it, finally having someone kneel down beside her and say, "This should not have been yours to clean." And maybe that isn't revenge in the dramatic way people expect. There was no public collapse, no screaming confession, no courtroom twist, no thunder. Just a dead woman's steady handwriting and a room full of people forced to hear what had always been true. But sometimes that is the most satisfying kind of ending there is. Not destruction. Recognition. My brother mocked me at the funeral. Then my name was read first. But the part that stayed with me wasn't the look on his face, or Melissa's silence, or the fact that for once no one could talk over me. It was my mother's words, reaching across everything we failed to repair in time and leaving me something cleaner than revenge. She left me proof. And sometimes proof is the closest thing a wounded heart ever gets to peace.